was born overseas, and we came to the States when I was 6 going on 7. And I grew up in Central Florida in a predominantly white neighborhood, and I went to parochial school, so I went to private school from elementary to middle school. And when you're a little kid, you don't necessarily think about, like, what's my race, what's my ethnicity, what's the difference between race and ethnicity, and then what it has to do with your culture. And I remember just being aware, at home we spoke Spanish, in school I spoke English, most of my friends did not look like me. There weren't many people that looked like me in my school. And I remember particularly in 5th grade, one of my good friends, like somebody that I was close to, I don't know what was happening at the time or why she said it. Honestly, I have absolutely no recollection of it, other than in the middle of lunch, she just goes, "Well, you're not like them." And I'm like them who? And she says, "Well, all the Puerto Ricans." I was like, "Well, because I'm not Puerto Rican." And just being offended that she thought I was Puerto Rican, because in Latin America we take our nationality very seriously, and it's something that we're very proud of. But also just being like, well, how can you not know the difference? Like, we all, we speak Spanish, but it doesn't mean that we're all the same and our cultures are the same. And then thinking about it as an adult, just thinking exactly what did that mean, because it wasn't a super positive comment. And as a kid, how I didn't realize that's kind of a racist question, statement. And then how does a little kid that's that old know that something's good, something's bad, and being called Puerto Rican would have been an insult because I wasn't like them, right? And that, the older I get and the more I learn and read about race relations, the more that sticks out in my head. And growing up not with a lot of people that looked like me, just, you never feel like you fit in anywhere. And whenever we would go back to our home country, not feeling like you belong there either, right? So my sister and I would always say, well, that's not home, but this isn't home either, like, meaning where we were living, where we grew up, where we spent almost all of our time at, and wondering very, early on, well, what's home? And what do you hold on to? And, when I, went to school, moved to Baltimore, and I've been in Baltimore for 10 years. And when I first moved here, I worked at a predominantly African-American high school where there were maybe about 10% Latinx kids. And I worked in the front office, and the kids would always come into the office because it was just a fun place to hang out, apparently. And it's a very small high school, and the kids feel like your family because there's less than 300 kids in the school. And when I first started working there, right shortly after I moved to Baltimore, my kids, they would tell me, they're like, well, Miss Jules, you're not Latina, you're very white. And I would look at my skin and I'm like, my skin says differently. And they would say, I was like, what do you mean? I would ask them, what do you mean I'm so white? And they're like, well, the way you talk, and you listen to white music, and you eat white food, because I was vegetarian then. And just having this realization that such little characteristics about yourself immediately placed you in a different race that you identify as. And so I would have these constant conversations with the kids. I would say, well, according to the census, yes, I am white, that is my race, but my ethnicity is Latina. And the kids having, to think about it and rationalize. I was like, well, it's just what the government tells you that you are. It's not who you are. And then asking them, why do you say that I'm white versus saying I'm Mexican or I'm Salvadoran? Because all of their Latinx classmates were either Mexican or Salvadoran. And then they would say, well, you're not like them either because you don't eat pupusas. Which is not true because I eat a lot of pupusas. And then they would say, well, you don't talk like them or like their parents or act like their parents. And I was like, so is it just the way my behavior is? They're like, but it's also the way you talk. And I was like, okay, so is it because I speak perfect English without an accent? They're like, I don't know. They're like, you're just very white. So just figuring out, like, how do I put all of these pieces of my appeared identity together and, like, what is my actual identity and how do I self-identify? Living in a city that's so clearly divided and so clearly stigmatized about its identity, right? And choosing to live in Baltimore, choosing to stay here, and constantly explain to people, well, yes, I'm Latina, but no, I'm not from Central America, and no, I'm not here stealing your jobs. And having those conversations quite frequently and having conversations about how, you know, my family came to the States and why we came to the States and explaining that and explaining that, you know, the immigrant community is not a monolith and we all have our very own unique stories is really interesting to me because a lot of the times people have this like perceived notion of who you are because of what you sound like or what you look like, and starting to like tear those down and figuring out how I identify and how I want to be looked at and perceived. You know, when I was a kid and I was growing up, I wasn't Latina. I didn't identify as Latina. I identified by my nationality because in Central Florida, everyone identified by their, you know, in the few spaces where there were a lot of Latinos together, which is, for me, it was my church. You know, there was the Puerto Rican group, there was the Cuban group, there was the Dominican group, and then there was like all of the other countries that kind of had their own little cliques. And always being very proud of that, just not self-identifying as Latina until I got into high school and had to check in standardized testing and, you know, when I'm applying for college. And then moving here and connecting with it. I think one of the most interesting things for me about Baltimore and how diverse it is learning to embrace that. Like, I very proudly now say, I'm like, yeah, I'm Latina. This is where my nationality is, and explaining that and having that conversation with people, but, you know, growing up never taking ownership of that, never being like, yeah, I'm Latina. It was more like, this is my nationality, and this is how my culture is different from other cultures, and now seeing that there's so much more power in just embracing your identity, and then having the courage to talk about it and not feel like, oh, this is so different, so you can't talk about it. It makes people uncomfortable. Well, you know, we don't live in a great world. It's not perfect, so sometimes we all have to be uncomfortable, and just because my Latinidad makes you uncomfortable doesn't mean that I need to silence that or I need to be more soft-spoken about it. And, you know, thinking about what is home and what am I and who am I constantly. Like, I feel like I'm constantly trying to, like, analyze myself and be like, well, where do you fit? How do you fit? And where's home? You know, my parents no longer live in Central Florida. They moved with my sister to another part of Florida, so now my idea of home isn't there. When I say I'm going home, I'm to visit my parents. I'm going to visit my parents in a city that's not home to me, that I have no memories of. But going back to my birthplace doesn't feel like home either. And realizing that after 10 years, Baltimore is home. And Baltimore is where I feel like I have my connections, and I have my roots, and I have my identity. You know, so much of my identity is built around a lot of the work that I do and a lot of the organizing that I do. And realizing that that's enough. Like, I don't need to, like, explain it to people all the time, and I don't need to be mad at the census because it doesn't let me identify the way I want to. That living and talking and sharing your stories just gives you like a common place, and that's where you go from, right? Like you start just talking about it and just saying, this is who I am, and I'd love to learn about you too. And hoping that goes somewhere and that message resonates with people, and just being comfortable with who you are and being proud of it. You know, there's so many people that struggle with that, like identity. I know, like second and third generation kids, and you know, like third culture kids. Like I'm always like, yeah, like I wouldn't raise like if I had kids, I wouldn't necessarily raise my kids as strictly as my parents did, because I understand that it was different, right? Like having to explain, yeah, this is, you know, the way my parents do it because they're crazy. And then realizing, no, it's just a cultural thing. It was a different culture, and my culture was different than my parents, and it was just, you know, the effects of not having been raised overseas and being raised here, and being okay with that, and being okay with, like, that's part of my identity now. The crazy things that, you know, her Latina mom does are so much part of your like your own identity and your culture. It's like, you know, I would tell my kids I'm gonna like throw my shoe at you, and having to explain to them, yeah, like that's kind of the way some Latina moms treat their kids, is it's I'm gonna throw a chancla, and the kids be like, your family was weird. I was like, talk to all of your other friends, their moms probably did that too. And being okay with that, being like, okay, so that's part of my like weird culture that's different to some people, and that's fine. And you know, I want to learn about timeout because I was never put in timeout. So, you know, it's all of our experiences. They're different.